in Siracusa. She is the patron saint of Siracusa because she was martyred there. So moving on, we move on to another painter who's a little later than Caravaggio, El Greco, whose work, this is his mature style, which is extremely mannerist. And as you probably remember, he was born in Crete, which is why he's called El Greco. He, because Crete was ruled by Venice, he went on to Venice and studied with artists in Venice, and then went on to Rome, where he really started to develop his mature style. But he wasn't that popular in Rome because he had a very high opinion of himself. He told the Pope that he'd like to repaint The Last Judgment by Michelangelo, do his own version. And he was,
Anthony,
yeah.
That's him right there with the little beard, right? On the bottom of the painting?
Down where? Here? No.
No, right here, like in the, you know, where there's all those men, the one with the beard right here to the left, is that not El Greco?
This one on the left?
First, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth.
I don't know, actually. Where did you get that information?
Well, he looks like when we went to Sicily and we went to Catania, we went to the castle.
Yeah.
And they had a picture of El Greco, and it was a Greco a picture. I mean, it was a painting of El Greco, and he looked like him. And it looks like this guy right there.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, a lot of his people look very similar, actually, if you look at them. I'm not sure. Okay. I don't know that. But this is one of his most famous paintings because from Rome. So in Rome, he didn't make a lot of friends, and he wasn't able to really advance that much. So when Philip II took over in Spain, he went to Spain hoping to be patronized, and he never actually was patronized by the king. His work was a little too strange and radical for the court, but he found patrons in the church, and so he remained there. And he was extremely devout. Well, you can see it in this painting. And he also was a real staunch supporter of the Inquisition. And the Inquisition was headquartered in Toledo, and this is one of his only landscapes, a painting of Toledo, which is a beautiful painting. It has a certain threatening quality to it, which we read into it, knowing that it was the headquarters of the Inquisition. The Inquisition in Spain, gradually a Spanish Inquisition with the Counter-Reformation, which was now in course at this point, gradually spread throughout the whole Catholic world and basically shut down creative thinking in the Catholic world, especially in Italy, actually. A landscapist of a completely different type, Peter Bruegel, though he and El Greco were in Italy within 10 years of each other and were hosted by the same miniaturist painter there. So, but Bruegel was in Protestant, the lowlands in Protestant country, and his work was much less religious, and the focus of his work was really the later work was the peasant life, a way of life that was actually dying, and he's really the preeminent artist of the peasant world in the whole of Western art, and his landscapes are, I think, spectacular. If you look at this landscape, it's beautifully composed. He breaks his landscape up into huge areas of color, creating a wonderful overall design into which he places his figures very strategically. You've got to understand these landscapes may have been put together from various sketches, but they're not they're not real places. He's creating these places. And this was part of a series that he did of the months of the year, which he was commissioned to do, the seasons, which he never finished. But in contrast to this season, which is the high point of summer with the grain harvest, you have this, which really feels cold. And also he, like Dürer before him, made a lot of his living, especially in the beginning, making prints, because in the north, they didn't have the church to sponsor them. The Protestant churches were not buying art, and you didn't have the royal houses as you had in all the different principalities, each of which had his favorite artist. So the patronage was somewhat spotty. So you could count on a regular income from prints. But in the process, he obviously learned a huge amount about design, because the design of this is just brilliant. And the way he sets these figures coming back out of from the hunt against the snow and ties them in with the trees to create this really strong design element here is brilliant. You also note that he pushes them into the foreground by making them so dark. They're the darkest things in really one of the darkest areas in the whole painting. And then he creates this wonderful landscape with very muted colors and almost just a brown and an earth green with a little bit of red here and there. So his countrymen, who, see if I can find it here, Peter Paul Rubens, who is, as it says here, 1577, he was born, and Bruegel is 1527, so they're 50 years apart, which is not a long time. But unlike Bruegel, because Bruegel spent a long time in Italy, 4 years in Italy actually, longer than Rubens. Rubens was completely converted to the Italianate style, and he becomes the exemplar of Baroque. But he was also a brilliant portraitist, and I really love this portrait of his wife, his first wife, because she looks so smart, and it seems like she's about to say something. But this is more his stock in trade. He was a writer. He was a diplomat. He was a collector and a dealer. And as a diplomat, he was not a minor diplomat. He was a major diplomat who was knighted by both the King of England and the King of Spain for his work bringing some sort of peace between Britain and England after the Armada, which had happened a while before. But he was the one who sort of patched things up and helped them to work towards a more peaceful coexistence. But he served the royalty, and he had no doubt as to who was in charge and the righteousness of kings. And this is the kind of spectacular work he would do for the royalty. It's really an incredible piece of painting. I mean, a real virtuosity here. And we'll see other artists inspired by this, in particular Delacroix, to some extent inspired by Rubens. But the thing about Rubens is he has this incredible ability, but you don't feel, and there's a sense of incredible drama here, you don't feel a lot of emotion in a lot of his work. Mm. So, not just 12 years younger, Frans Hals is sort of the opposite of Rubens. He never leaves Holland. He lives near Amsterdam, because in the time between the height of Rubens' career and the rising careers of Rembrandt and Frans Hals, the center of trade has shifted from Antwerp to Amsterdam. So Frans Hals is, though he originates in Antwerp, he actually ends up living in Haarlem near Amsterdam. And he's a real stick in the mud. He barely ever leaves the Haarlem. If people want to come and be painted by him, they have to come to his studio in Haarlem. He wouldn't even budge for a lot of money. And this is a very famous painting of his, and it gives you some idea of his amazing ability to paint faces. It's too bad that Cassandra isn't watching right now, because these faces.
I'm here.
Oh, there you are. Okay, Cassandra, look at these faces. These faces would have been done in one go. I mean, not both of them, but one of them would have definitely been painted in one session, in probably a couple, 2 or 3 hours, is my guess. And you can see what makes him very famous is the freshness of his brushwork and the facility of his work, and also the way he plays the whites, blacks, and slightly modified grays off against some pure color here. It's really dramatic. It's say it again.
Oh, I was just saying, yeah, it is. It's great. Even just the highlights are wonderful. And then the
Yeah, and look, in the background here, you can see the fireplace and the inn owner who's watching them. And while Jonker Ramp is toasting whatever with his beer glass, he's also at the same time petting the dog down at the bottom. It's actually very dramatic, very beautiful piece of painting. This is interesting. We're going to see another painter do the same thing, but in this painting, well, a couple of other painters go into this realm of madness, because she was in an asylum where a family member was also living. And it's one of the first instances of painter painting someone who's considered insane. The owl is probably an allusion to the Dutch phrase "as drunk as an owl," because she's got a beer mug here, and maybe that's how he kept her happy while he painted her. But this one was probably done incredibly fast, because I would not expect her to have been the most accommodating model. But it's a really interesting painting, and a courageous thing to do, because there wasn't any money in something like this, right? He wasn't going to sell this. This is the beginning when the artists no longer have their patrons and are serving the upper middle class and a few really super wealthy people. They're starting to paint more and more for themselves as well. And Rembrandt is an example of someone who did an enormous amount of work for himself. He has a Catholic mother and a Protestant father who was a miller, and he was raised in contact with both religions, but he lived in Amsterdam, in Protestant Amsterdam, and he'd studied the classics. He'd studied Latin. He was an avid reader of the Bible, and the biblical stories lived for him, and he was constantly painting them. I mean, sometimes for patrons, but more often than not, just for himself. In terms of prints, though, he could sell prints with religious stories, because and this is one of his most famous prints, which went through any number of variations. But it's probably, to me, it's one of the most empathetic depictions of Christ in the Western canon. I mean, he seems so gentle and so concerned about these poor and desperate people. It's really an incredibly powerful image. And this was actually later in life, when he was not allowed himself to handle money anymore because he'd gone bankrupt, and his mistress and his son would peddle his prints to keep them solvent, because he'd also fallen out of fashion. But during the height of his career, he would do paintings like this. Again, I'm not quite sure if this was actually painted for a patron. Probably not. It's Heinrike, his mistress after his wife died, and she's posing as Bathsheba, who has just received a letter from King David saying, "You have to choose between me and your husband." And what's very interesting to me is the depiction of nakedness by Rembrandt is much more natural than the Italian depictions of nakedness, and much more vulnerable. The nakedness here isn't really provocative. It's more about vulnerability. And just a stunningly beautiful painting. Also notice his distortions of scale in his painting.
Mm-hmm.
That hand is huge.
Mm.
He takes great liberties to express, and the sense of what you get here is, as opposed to those Italian paintings, is you're in her mind and you're thinking, what is she thinking? What is she feeling? Which is, Rembrandt is the master of introspection. That's what he does with the chiaroscuro of Caravaggio. Caravaggio gives you these incredibly dramatic events that upset you and maybe even terrify you. Rembrandt takes you inside the characters. This is, as you probably know, known as the Jewish Bride. I don't really know what it's about, but the tenderness in this painting is really quite amazing. And the use of the brushwork and palette knife work in here too, if you look at the paint, it's just wonderful. And just as we'll see with Turner, and actually with other artists, though we haven't covered it, artists often have particular stories that obsess them. And for Rembrandt, curiously enough, it was the story of the prodigal son. And this was painted very near the last year of his life, I think. But the prodigal son, the story appears throughout his work. But it's an interesting story for him to be so obsessed with, because he himself was in many ways a prodigal son. He was immensely wealthy at one point, and he squandered his wealth, he mismanaged his money, to the point where just about everything was taken away from him. And his son and his mistress had to do all the business dealings for him. It's a sad story in a certain way, but here he is almost at the end of his life doing a spectacular painting, which is so rich in emotion and storytelling. Here's the other brother, the one who was loyal and who didn't waste the money the father gave him, looking very annoyed that his father's is welcoming back the prodigal son and is going to, slaughter the calf for him. And probably his business advisor here. But the sense of love and in here is just, and the desperate nature, because the story of the prodigal son is a metaphor, especially within the Protestant world, for coming back to God and being accepted by God despite whatever you've done. So different. Vermeer. I mean, it's like, whoa, after Rembrandt, who's in this empathetic personal realm, to come on Vermeer, who gives you this very cool but quite beautiful and very realistic, almost photographic depiction of his world, and whose paintings are more like precious objects. And this is one of his humbler paintings, The Milkmaid, which is really actually a domestic servant making a bread pudding. But I think I mentioned to you before, and it's important that in Dutch painting at this time, even ordinary scenes are not exactly ordinary. There's a lot of symbolism in them. And traditionally, the milkmaids were seen as women who were easy, and the master of the house might have taken advantage of them. And this was usually indicated by large figures like cupids, or this little heating thing here, which you'd often stand over with your skirts around it to warm yourself up. And so it was a kind of titillating image. But Vermeer has pushed these. There's actually a little, if you can see it here, I don't know, there's a little, oh, here he is. Yeah, Cupid here. And he's pushed those symbols to the back, because really what he's dealing with here is a domestic moment and a really beautiful painting of someone at work in a household. And look at this lovely painting in the shade here of these objects. Amazing control of value. He also did a couple of really unusual cityscapes, unusual for their objectivity and their naturalness, which we're going to see again. And, because he, like the next artist we're going to see, Canaletto, was aware of the camera oscura and had at least looked through it. We don't know how much he actually used it, but he was the camera, in a sense, already existed, in the sense you could look through it. And it had a definite effect on the way artists saw the world, whether or not they used it as an actual tool. This painting was in the family at the time of his untimely death, when he, let's see, just a second. I've got to get the date right here. In 1672, known as the year of the disaster, the French, Louis XIV, invaded Holland. The Dutch, to stop him conquering the whole country, flooded the entire country, destroying their economy. And meanwhile, the English decided to attack again, because England and Holland had been at war. I mean, this region, which was so prosperous and produced so many great artists, was in constant conflict. It's hard to imagine how they did these works of art in the midst of all this chaos. But he, because of financial difficulties and loans he couldn't pay back, got so stressed that he seemed to have died. We don't know what he died of, but maybe a heart attack, but he died quite young. This painting, The Art of the Painter is the title, is interesting because, again, there's a lot of symbolism in it. We think this actually might be him. And if you remember last time, I told you that he'd married a Catholic woman, and the mother-in-law had insisted he become Catholic. And her house, where he ended up moving in, was attached by a secret tunnel to a secret Catholic church. So he was leading a double life. And so there's a certain secrecy to him all the time. It's probably part of his nature. But in this, and he's embraced to a large extent the symbols and the art of the Catholic world in his work too, even though he's in Protestant Spain, Protestant lowlands. But this woman who's the muse here is holding an instrument and a book, because in those days it was considered that the inspiration of painting was music and poetry. So this, and there are many other symbols in here. I don't even know all of them, but so these everyday scenes are replete with meaning that could be read by people of his period. So Canaletto is born about 60 years after Vermeer, but there's a lot of similarities in his work, which to some extent are probably the result of both of them being aware of the camera obscura. In the case of Canaletto, we know he actually owned a camera obscura. We found it with his initials on it. And also we know he's using it to establish at least the details of a scene, not to draw the painting itself, but to make studies. Because a lot of these views are from upper stories, and if you're going to use the camera obscura outside, you had to have a tent because it had to be dark around you to be able to look at the ground glass screen and see the image. But if you're looking out a window, you can pull a curtain around it and you can look into it and see it and use it. But his work, as I discussed when we covered it in depth, he took certain views and he did them over and over again in different lighting, different moods. And this was one of his favorite. This is one of his most famous paintings, the Stonemason's Yard, which owes a lot to Northern European painting because it's telling a story about everyday life, the stonemasons at work and the different processes in the trade. Later in his life, his patrons, because he started painting in Rome outdoors, actually. If you remember, his father was a scene painter for the opera in Venice, and they were invited to do the scenery for a opera in Rome, and he came with his father, and there he met artists who were actually painting outdoors, and he started doing it himself. When he came back to Venice, he continued this practice, and he was befriended by British noblemen who, because Venice had become the place all the British came to, and they became his patrons. Well, eventually there were the wars in Europe, and the British were unable to come. So for a period of a decade, Canaletto lived in London. And so he goes from painting one of the oldest continuing societies in Europe, the 1,000-year-old Republic of Venice, now in complete decline. It had already just lost its final battle against the Turks, to England, London, which has been rebuilt after the Great Fire by Sir Christopher Wren, who built the most famous thing he built was St. Paul's Cathedral. But he also built these Wren churches, which became the model for churches on the East Coast in the United States. The church with the spire in the front, that was his invention. And he actually did design some buildings for colonial America. But London is the emerging marine superpower. So he paints the declining power of the Mediterranean and now the emerging global maritime power. It's kind of interesting. And this particular place he's painting, Richmond House, is only about 10 years old when he paints here. So it's maybe a little older, but it's very new. And St. Paul's is very clean and white too. So it's a very different world, but he does amazing things with it and has a huge influence on British painters, including J.M.W. Turner, who are very aware of his work, because huge amounts of his work were in British collections, including the Royal Collection. Okay, so both of the previous painters were technically in the Rococo period, though, in the Mannerist II Rococo period. Francisco Goya begins in the Rococo period, but unlike the French Rococo, which is very really frivolous. Goya gives kind of significance to his early paintings. These paintings, now Goya was born into a very humble family and had to work like crazy to work his way up as an artist and then work his way into the court. And for a period, he went to Italy when he couldn't advance any further in Spain, won a prize in Italy and came back and used that to gain access to the business of two brothers who were providing the King of Spain, the royal family, with designs for tapestries. This is a huge painting which would be used as a tapestry, as a design for a tapestry. He ended up marrying the sister of these two brothers, which is quite common. You see this over and over again in the stories of these artists. They marry someone who they need in order to move forward, who are related to someone they need to move forward in their careers. It was quite common. But the interesting thing to me about this painting is that it's for royalty, and of course the foregrounded are members of nobility, but he's included the workers, not just this beautiful woman with the basket of grapes, which must be pretty heavy, actually. It's a big basket. But the field workers in there too, because he comes from the working class himself, and he feels connected to them. And this is something that will appear throughout his work. He never loses his sense of being one of the people. He's not a social climber who turns his back on his origins. Well, as things went from bad to worse, the royal family in charge at this point was fairly liberal, but they were incompetent and lazy. And things went from bad to worse in Spain. And he produced a series of etchings called the Caprichos, which were kind of metaphorical criticism of the society that he lived in, but sufficiently metaphorical that and sufficiently he didn't actually do the likenesses of anyone important. So these prints were actually very popular and accepted at the time he did them. But here's some poor woman who's about to be executed by the Inquisition. But you can see his aquatint etchings are spectacular. He was a master of them. Well, as things went from bad to worse, as Spain descended into a three-part war, the British against the French and the Spanish against everyone, but especially against the French, and it turned into a madhouse in Spain. He would later paint his impressions of that horror. First, he did the prints called The Horrors of War, which were not, the Disasters of War, which were never published in his lifetime because they were critical not just of the French, but also the Spanish authorities. But these paintings were painted at the end of the conflict to memorialize some of the horrible moments. There was a big rebellion by the Spanish, and on May 2nd, May 3rd, and that I showed you that painting last time, and this is May 3rd when the French are executing them. In my mind, the greatest anti-war painting that's ever been painted. I think it's more powerful even than Guernica because it's so immediate. But privately, he's becoming more and more disenchanted with the society and with the social order, which is one of the things, he's considered one of the first romantics. And that's one of the things that distinguishes the Romantics. They're the first artists to take a really critical look at their societies, and often to be highly critical of them in their work. This is an asylum, but it's an asylum where one man thinks he's a French soldier, another man thinks he's the Pope and he's blessing the viewer, and someone else thinks he's a king. It's Goya saying this world and a madhouse are the same thing. And his paintings at this point, and for some time now, of course, he's deaf, and he's suffering a terrible state of constant tinnitus, constant loud noises in his head. And it's from this point on that his work becomes dark like this, though he's also fulfilling, his commissions for the royal family. We're now in France. And in fact, Jacques-Louis David is only 2 years younger than Goya. In France, even before David, people were getting tired of Rococo, which I haven't even included in this review. There was a movement towards a kind of neoclassicism, which I think also coincided with the ideas of the Enlightenment, which were spreading throughout Europe during this time, and a reconsideration of classical ideas of liberty, etc. And David, who came from a very wealthy family, whose father died in a duel when he was quite young, and who was farmed out by his mother to some wealthy uncles, and schooled entirely in the classical tradition, saw the world completely through classical eyes, as did many of his contemporaries, but he was an extreme case. And in this painting, it's the story of Brutus, but it's an early Brutus, a Brutus who founded the Republic of Rome, and whose two sons tried to restore the monarchy, and he condemned them both to death. And in this painting, his sons are being returned to the household after being executed, and he's here trying to bear the weight of his decision. And of course, his wife and daughters are totally emotionally distraught. But look at the way it's composed, how it's composed on set within verticals and horizontals. And even though this movement is across the picture frame, this is the quite typical of classical paintings. They unite the figures with the architecture in a very formal and static, almost static way. Anyway, this, in a certain way, this painting prefigures David's own life, because when the revolution starts, he takes the side of the revolutionaries because he's in favor of the idea of a new republic, the end of monarchy. And he works closely with Robespierre and Marat, who, of course, to defend the young republic, institute the Reign of Terror, getting rid of all the nobles who they think are going to be a danger, because the nobles were calling for the aid of the other nobles in other countries. They were calling for an invasion of France. There was a reason for the Reign of Terror, though it got totally out of hand. So when Marat dies, David paints this memorial to him, makes him sort of it's almost a pietà to the revolution. Marat had welcomed a woman into his house who had a list of people who needed to be executed, but she came there to actually kill him. David was incredibly close with Marat and with Robespierre, and he signed the death warrant of the king, and I think of the queen as well. And he was also he was sort of the master of ceremonies for all the revolutionary ceremonies during this period. He also designed the outfits for the new state, the uniforms, which were very much in the style of ancient Roman costumes. This was one of his students, and quite a talented artist who is also a classicist, but betrays a sort of, he's almost romantic at times, but he never could move into romanticism because the classicists were ideologues and they were totally set on their way of working and utterly opposed to the romantic movement. And I think it actually, in the end, destroyed him. For a while, he celebrated Napoleon. He traveled with him on his early campaigns. Later, he apparently became disillusioned as it became clear that Napoleon was no longer just spreading the great ideas of the revolution, but was also seeking absolute power in Europe and seeking to become a new Caesar, essentially. This painting is a propaganda piece. He represents Napoleon as almost a saint who's willing to touch the body of one of these French soldiers who have the plague. It's a propaganda piece. He didn't actually do this. And in fact, when he abandoned Jaffa, where this happened, where this story took place, he told his doctors to poison the soldiers who still had the plague. And the doctors refused to do it. But Gross remained an important figure and was a teacher he was the teacher of Delacroix, and for a short term, I believe, of Géricault. But he ended up committing suicide. I think because he lost his way as an artist. The third of the classicists and the latest, and the one who was the most rigid in his ideas of classicism was Ingres, who absolutely detested Delacroix and was a magnificent portraitist, and also indulged, like all these French painters of this period did, in a sort of Orientalism, because France, in its conquests, had now made contact with the East, and the artists were, and Africa, the artists were fascinated. But this is sort of an extreme male fantasy. He would not have ever gained entrance to a Turkish bath. He was never near one. But this painting was not actually shown publicly very much during his lifetime. It was only in a big retrospective in 1905 after his death that it was seen, and two of the artists who saw it were Matisse and Picasso, who went crazy for it, especially Picasso. He was, because of his draftsmanship and the way he creates these very simple abstract shapes, even with the figures, he was very much admired by the artists of the early 20th century. So Géricault, a young, not very healthy young man, who was born in northern France on the Channel and raised in the tradition of British sports painting when he was very young, and had like many of the people of northern France, had a close connection to Britain actually, He studies for a while with a classicist, I think it was Gross, but I'm not quite sure, and decides that he doesn't like classicism, and he spends several years copying paintings at the Louvre. In particular, he's copying Rubens and Titian and Rembrandt and Velázquez. Rembrandt had gone into disfavor after his death, but the Romantics revive interest in him because they love his empathy, they love his brushwork, the mood, the incredible emotive power of his work. Because the Romantics, who are highly critical of the world and the way it's changing around them, are into expressing emotion and also exploring the dark side of human nature, because they can see that that's one of the things that's creating so much trouble in the world. So at some point in his early career, he gives up painting for a couple of years and joins the barracks at Versailles as a horseman, and then decides to go to Italy for a while to escape an affair that he was having with an aunt. In Italy, he's totally blown away by the Italian artists, particularly by Michelangelo. And you can see in some of the figures, you can see echoes of Michelangelo. Mm. But he returns to France, and the time he returns, there's this story of this ship which was heading for Africa and going along the African coast with hundreds of passengers, and it ran aground because of the incompetence of the captain. And there were not enough lifeboats, so they built a raft for those passengers who wouldn't fit in the lifeboats. They attached the raft to the lifeboats with the idea of hauling it behind them, which didn't work. So they cut the ropes to the raft and left it drifting in the ocean with originally something like 140 people on it. At this moment that he's depicting, and he did an immense amount of research for this painting, and in fact included some of the people who were on the raft. This is the moment at which they sight a ship after being at sea for, I think, something like 15 days. During these 15 days, with no water and almost no food, there were fights, a lot of people were killed. There was a certain amount of cannibalism. And at the point that they were saved, there were not much more than a dozen people alive. He's dramatized it. At the point they were saved, it was a still ocean, actually, and not cloudy. But he wanted to convey the whole essence of what they'd suffered in one painting. Well, one of the figures in this, the people who posed for this were friends of his mostly, as well as a few of the survivors. And notice the composition is not classical at all. It has an incredible movement through it, which is typical of pretty much all Romantic work. This young man, this figure here, was his younger friend Delacroix, who posed. And Delacroix, when he saw this painting in progress, was just so excited. He apparently ran all the way back to his home in excitement, and he realized that what Géricault was doing was the future of painting. Now, Géricault had a short life, and partly because of TB, partly because of injuries from falling from horses. But before he died, he did a whole series of paintings of people in an insane institution. And they're really incredibly powerful paintings. And of course, again, they're not the kind of thing you would expect an artist to paint who was trying to sell work. These were done for his own interest, because he was interested in exploring the psyche and the mentality and the feeling of these people and their predicament. But the use of color here is stunning. And look at the almost pure yellow in the highlight on the forehead here. So while Géricault was still alive and he was close friends with Delacroix, he told Delacroix about a painter he discovered in England, who I would have shown at this point, because they're, in terms of the timeline, they're about the same, but I'm continuing through the French art first before I go to England. And Delacroix went and looked at Constable's painting, and after he saw it, he changed the background of this painting, which is the massacre at Skios in Greece, a massacre that was written about by Lord Byron, the great English romantic poet, who was read by all the romantic painters. Delacroix read him, Géricault read him, G.M.W. Turner, who actually is a little older than these painters, also read him and did many paintings based on what he'd written. But and whereas the classicists would have painted a picture much more static than this, that would in some way be a celebration of power or triumph, this is a moment before a massacre. The Turk here is drawing his sword. He's about to kill these prisoners who are pleading with him. This created sensation when it showed in Paris. And this created an even greater sensation because it was painted during the time of the revolution. You know, France went through, after the first revolution, which was sort of reversed by Napoleon, it went through successive revolutions, getting to a point where it could be a stable democracy. In 1830, there was a revolution. They got rid of one monarch and they ended up with another one. So it wasn't very successful. But he painted this during the period of the revolution. It's liberty leading the people. And created a sensation because by the time it was actually shown, there was another monarch in charge. But I wonder if this figure here wasn't one of the inspirations for the Statue of Liberty in the United States, which of course was created by a French sculptor. But the painting of the figures on the ground, a lot of this is reminiscent actually of Goya. And here we see one of the things that Delacroix was doing, and also Turner, as we will see, is doing, is they're both very aware of modern color theory, which had been awakened both by the work of Sir Isaac Newton and also by the work of Chevreul at the tapestries in France, who proposed the theory of complementary contrast. And both Turner and Delacroix applied these theories to their painting. And here you can see that the result of their understanding of color and light and natural lighting effects, you have a painting that might almost be an Impressionist painting, except it's a shipwreck. So there's the historical element to it. Figures sheltering here, figures around the wrecked ship. Well, Delacroix spent a while in North Africa. You know, one of the themes that becomes more and more powerful in French art as we move into the modern era is escapism into another world, another culture, because a lot of the artists were finding the bourgeois French culture unbearable. And this is Delacroix's escape, based on secretive sketches he did in Algiers of Algerian Muslim women. But this had a huge effect on the next generation of artists. Van Gogh and Gauguin both made a special trip because it's actually in a museum near Arles, and to see this painting, and as did Cézanne, and they were all impressed by the use of the very rich and beautiful use of color in the painting, and also the naturalness of the light. So we're now going to move to England, where the greatest romantic landscape painter probably in the world, and one of the greatest British painters, was working. This painting is in the middle of his career. It's a little bit more than the middle of his career. It's the first time he was able to do a long journey in Europe, because the wars were over. And it was, let me see, Dordeck is the title of it, and it's 1818. And when he would travel, quite regularly to Europe from now on, and he would walk hundreds of miles, and he would travel to really out of the way locations by carriage or horse. He was and everywhere he went, he would sketch all the time. And he would also do watercolors, and he would bring these back. And during the winter in London, he would paint pictures like this. And this is, I think, a real master in terms of his work. It's the middle of the period of his work, and it's, I think, extremely masterful painting, beautiful painting. If you have any comments, you're welcome to make them as we go here. This is one of the other aspects, because Turner, like Delacroix, whereas Turner was very interested in landscape and Delacroix usually put it in the background. Turner was also, like Delacroix, fascinated and very much caught up in Greek and Roman mythology. And just as Rembrandt had the story of the prodigal son as something that followed him throughout his life, Turner was totally caught up in the story of Aeneas, and who took his father out of burning Troy, and was sort of the symbol of filial piety. And this was painted after his father's death, significantly. And it's the point when Aeneas, reaching Naples, which at the time would have been Neapolis under the Greeks, goes to the Sibyl and requests entrance to the underworld to see his father. And the Sibyl says, "You have to bring me the golden bough," which she's holding up here. He's obviously brought it to her. And so then he can enter the underworld, which is a volcano, appropriately enough. And actually this gas here would be toxic gas. Dancing in a circle here are the fates. And over here is a serpent representing death. So, but he's expressing his own desire to be reunited with his father, because he never really recovered from his father's death. Well, the burning of the Houses of Parliament in London gave him the chance to paint a history painting of a very current moment. He did dozens of watercolor sketches during the 2 days that the houses were burning, and did a number of paintings, which are among his more famous paintings. And you see how well he handles fire in this painting. This is a result of his study of color theory. After his father's death, he would spend time at a guest house run by a woman, and her husband, her husband, who was quite old, was an ex-sea captain. And he told Turner about the slave trade and the fact that in the case of a major storm, they would throw the dead and the dying over, because if they came into port with dead bodies, they got no insurance. But if they were lost at sea, they got insurance for them. Mm-hmm. So this was Turner's statement about the horrors of the slave trade. Mm. Later, he would actually, after her husband died, he would take up with this woman and actually spend the rest of his life with her under an assumed identity, because he had a double identity. He felt more comfortable hanging out on the waterfront with sailors than he did in the Royal Academy, of which he was a very important member. But so he had this other identity on the waterfront and with his mistress. But here he's in Venice. He spends a lot of time in Venice, and well, he takes at least 2 long visits to Venice and sketches like mad. This is an oil painting done back in the studio. The island here is the island where the dead are buried, and it's done. This painting is painted after the death of Byron, who was buried here. So it occurs to me that one of the things that's going through his mind when he paints this is his thoughts on Byron, who'd had such a huge influence on his whole life. Once more, right before his death, he returns to the story of Aeneas. But here's Aeneas' relationship with Dido, the queen of Carthage, which would end up fighting 3 wars with Rome, much later, with Rome, and eventually lose. But Aeneas is well, he's actually, his ship is washed ashore at Carthage, and he's a guest of Queen Dido, and that this romance starts up, and they're going to visit the grave of her husband in an attempt to cool down their romance. It doesn't work, and they have a romance, and then the gods tell Aeneas, you have a job to do. You have to go found Rome. So he leaves, and she commits suicide. But it's interesting to me that he paints this right in the last year of his life when he's in pretty bad shape. And you wonder if he's thinking about his mistress and what's going to happen to her after he dies. I don't know. But a very interesting painting. And you see how radical and almost abstract his work has become at this point. Well, another painter who's considered one of the Romantics, and is radical in his own way, but in a very different way, John Constable. This was painted, as you probably remember, during his honeymoon when he was on the coast with his wife near Weymouth. And it's an area I know very well because it's Dorset, where my grandparents lived. But Constable never left England, and as much as possible stayed whenever he could, within a few miles of where he'd been born, and painted those subjects. Because his father was a wealthy mill owner. He'd had a very wonderful childhood, and the love of his life was his home and the countryside around his home. But this is countryside that's changing radically, even as he was painting it, as Britain became the first country in the world to industrialize. But in many of these paintings, you see hints of Impressionism before Impressionism. and definitely hints of the Barbizon school, which will be the next group that we watch, that we see, and who were more influenced by Constable's work than anyone's. It's interesting. The first major influence on the French painters was not Turner. Well, he had a big influence on Delacroix, but was actually Constable. It's later, at the height of Impressionism, that Turner becomes, again, very significant to French painters. This was the painting that Géricault saw when he was in England, and he immediately told his friend Delacroix about. And Constable's paintings were not that popular in England. He was trying to render the actual feeling and his love for the tangibility of the world in which he'd grown up. And the French were amazed at his technique and his use of color, his sense of light, the sparkle of his light. All these things really impressed them. But and in fact, he sold more paintings in France than he did in England. And he was invited to come to France. He could probably have become quite successful financially. But he said, I'd rather be a poor man in England than wealthy in a foreign country. It may have been partly because at that point his wife was sick with, even afterwards he could have done it, but no, he never wanted to leave England. But this painting, which was not bought in England, was bought by an Anglo-French dealer. It was shown in 1824 in the Academy and won a gold medal. Curiously enough, the next painter we're going to look at also won a gold medal here at the same time. We'll see his painting in a minute. But it would have a huge influence on the Barbizon school, because no one had really taken on landscape in this tangible a way. Even Turner tended to give more historical significance and drama to his landscapes. What Constable is doing is giving us the sort of damp, moody, real English landscape that you can almost feel and smell. And and he did a lot of painting outside too, which was fairly new to the extent that he did it. Well, after his wife died, they had a courtship of 8 years before they could actually marry. And he'd known her as a kid before they were romantically involved. And then they had 14 years before she died of TB. And this was painted, he didn't paint castles. That was Turner's thing. But after his wife's death, he paints this castle. And he remarks to a friend that it represents the ruin that he has become. It's a powerful painting. So another Englishman from further north on the east coast of England, from Nottinghamshire, actually the same area of England that Lord Byron was from, actually. And you got to understand, all these people were reading Byron, Shelley, Keats, Wordsworth. It was the food for their imagination. Anyway, Bonington is born in Nottingham, but his father decides to switch to the lace business at the very time that the Luddites are rebelling and the Luddite rebellion actually begins in Nottingham. And these are the weavers who, a huge amount of British industry through several counties was weaving. And all of a sudden they were introducing industrial looms, which were putting these highly skilled weavers who for generations had supported entire parts of England out of business. and they went into rebellion. And for 10 years, the British Army was chasing them around England. And actually, Lord Byron spoke in the House of Lords in defense of the Luddites, which was typical of the Romantics, because they had real doubts about the new industrial world that was being born. So Bonington, at 14, his father moves them to France, to Calais, because he wants to become a lace maker, and he can't use the new looms in England without being attacked by the Luddites. So he smuggles 2 modern looms out of England and takes them to Calais, where he sets up in business. And Bonington becomes Anglo-French, and very much at the same time that he's at this point already an accomplished watercolorist, he absorbs the French school of painting as well. And Delacroix meets him. Well, the first time he observes him in the Louvre, and he observes him because everyone's copying the big paintings on the wall, but Bonington is the only one who's copying in watercolors, because the French didn't do watercolors in those days. He switched over at a certain point to oils, and this is his most ambitious oil painting, which got real mixed reviews in France, because the critics thought that it wasn't a exalted enough subject. What were all these dead fish doing, and the fishermen selling the fish to the women? But it did get a gold medal at the Academy the same year, 1824, that Constable got a gold medal. And in this, so later, because he has a very short life, later he's encouraged by Delacroix to go to Italy. And this is it looks to me, actually, I'm not sure if it's an oil or a watercolor, but it's of the lagoon in Venice, and it has about it a lot of the qualities of Constable, actually. So you see, Bonington is kind of on the edge between the two cultures, and having a huge influence on the next generation of artists, even though he doesn't live very long. This is probably one of his most well-known paintings of Italy. It's a beautiful painting, which really captures, it's Verona, really captures a sense of the culture and the light of Italy. And also shows his ability to absorb certain aspects of Turner's work. And finally, one of his, very late in his career, in his Italian journey rather, a sketch along the coast, a view of Lerici, which I mentioned to you last time, is quite clearly a reference to the Romantic poet Shelley, who drowned in the waters out here and was burned on one of the beaches along here around Lerici. One of the things that is a giveaway is the funereal cypress, which is kind of in the center of the painting here. It also is it's an absolutely perfect evocation of the atmosphere, the light in along the Ligurian coast in Italy. Mm-hmm. But at this point, Shelley, that he painted this, Shelley has been dead for 4 years. Byron, who went off to Greece to lead an army in the liberation of Greece, has died of fever during the Battle of Missolonghi. And Keats is also dead. He died in Rome. So we're now at the point of the decline of Romanticism and the great writers, and near the end of the careers. Well, Delacroix will go on for a while, but Romanticism is beginning to be spent, and there's a whole new movement going to rise, and we will look at that next week. So that's it, folks. So Cassandra, we're